He had the physical tools to be a premier forward, but as we've seen so often in this game, the body can't carry what the mind won't focus on. Looking at the records today, the most glaring statistic isn't his scoring average. It's the fact that he only managed to log exactly 305 regular season games between 1979 and 1985 before he was out of the league for good. Television coverage at the time focused on his promise, portraying him as a blue-chip prospect who could thrive in the spotlight of the Big Apple. But reporters noted at the time that while Sly was physically present, he often seemed to be navigating his own private weather system, disconnected from the team's rhythm. This raised a question that would haunt his career. Why did a player with every natural advantage struggle to stay on the floor? The story of Sly Williams isn't just about a short career or missed potential. It's about a total unraveling that eventually led far away from the hardwood and into the cold reality of the justice system. To understand how a first-round pick ends up facing a grim kidnapping conviction decades later, you have to look at the cracks that were forming long before he ever wore a Knicks jersey. It all started with a recruiting battle in 1976 that proved Sly was just as capable of creating chaos off the court as he was of creating highlights on it. If you lived in Connecticut during the mid-70s, Sly Williams was more than just a ball player. He was a legend in the making. At Lee High School in New Haven, he was doing things on the court that didn't even seem possible for a teenager. He wasn't just beating teams, he was demoralizing them. During his 1975 to 1976 senior season, he put up astronomical numbers, averaging 31 points and 22 rebounds per game, according to local sports media reports. He was a force of nature, a man-child who could rebound like a center and run the break like a point guard, and every major program in the country was knocking on his door. The recruiting war for Sly eventually boiled down to two schools, Providence and the University of Rhode Island. It was a classic local drama, with fans and boosters on both sides treating his decision like a matter of life and passing. For a while, it looked like Providence had won the prize, but then came one of the most bizarre pivots in college sports history. In the fall semester of 1976, after verbally committing to Providence, Sly did a complete about-face. According to sports retrospectives, on the very first day of classes, while the Providence coaching staff was waiting for him to arrive, Sly walked onto the campus of the University of Rhode Island and enrolled there instead. According to records from that era, this move wasn't just a change of heart, it was a breach of trust that left the Providence community feeling betrayed and the URI staff wondering what they had truly signed up for. Media reports from those months questioned who was really making the decisions in Sly's life, as rumors swirled about outside influences and last-minute promises. It was an early glimpse into a pattern of behavior that would define his life, a tendency to make sudden, impulsive choices that left people in his wake confused and frustrated. He had the talent to change a program's destiny, but he was already showing that his word was only as good as his mood at the moment. That initial instability set a turbulent tone for his time in Kingston, where his scoring records would soon be overshadowed by a growing list of grievances from the people in charge. Sly Williams spent 3 years at the University of Rhode Island, and if you just looked at the box scores, you'd think everything was perfect. He was a 3-time All-Atlantic 10 selection, a scoring machine who could sleepwalk his way into 20 points and 10 boards. But behind the scenes, the relationship between Sly and the university was becoming increasingly fractured. He was a player who thrived on the freedom of the game but chafed under the structure of a program. According to public university records, between 1976 and 1979, Sly found himself at the center of multiple suspensions for missing team meals, skipping classes, and ignoring the basic requirements of a student athlete. He was constantly at odds with the coaching staff, most notably head coach Jack Kraft, who struggled to keep his star player in line. Major sports media reports at the time focused on Sly's undeniable brilliance on the court, but the whispers about his lack of discipline were starting to reach the ears of NBA scouts. There was a sense that Sly felt he was bigger than the school, a feeling that only grew as his fame expanded. According to university athletic archives, despite the friction, Sly stayed just long enough to set the school's single-season scoring record, before deciding he had seen enough of the college life. In the spring of 1979, he made the choice to leave Rhode Island a year early, turning his back on his degree to chase the riches of the professional game. Reporters noted at the time that while Sly was exiting on a statistical high note, he was also leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions about his work ethic and his ability to handle professional responsibility. He was entering the draft with the reputation of a player who could win you a game on Tuesday but might not show up for practice on Wednesday. It was a gamble that some teams weren't willing to take, but for a franchise like the New York Knicks, the allure of his physical gifts was too strong to pass up. They saw a superstar in the making, but they failed to see that the foundation was already starting to crumble before the first $1 million contract was ever signed. Stepping into Madison Square Garden as a New York Knick is a heavy experience for any player, but for a kid from New Haven like Sly Williams, it was supposed to be the ultimate homecoming. He arrived in the city during a time when the Knicks were a team searching for a new soul, stuck in that awkward transition period after the championship glory of the early 70s had faded into a distant memory. Sly wasn't coming in as the undisputed savior, but he had that raw physical presence that New York fans respect, a blue-collar toughness that eventually earned him the nickname the Garbage Man. He was the guy who would dive into the rows of seats for a loose ball or battle three defenders for a contested rebound, playing with a hungry, unrefined energy that made the Garden crowd sit up and take notice. According to Basketball Archives, Sly made his official NBA debut on October 12, 1979, stepping onto the floor for a franchise that was desperately trying to find a winning formula. He wasn't a superstar overnight. Instead, he had to fight for every second of playing time in a crowded rotation. Throughout that 1979 to 1980 season, the records show he appeared in 57 games, logging a modest average of 4.7 points per contest. It was a humble start for a first-round pick, but you could see the flashes of what he could become if he ever truly dedicated himself to the craft. Television coverage at the time focused on his promise, often highlighting his ability to outmuscle veterans who had been in the league for a decade. Reporters noted at the time that while his physical talent was undeniable, the Knicks front office was already having a hard time figuring out how to fit his unpredictable personality into a disciplined system. There was a sense that Sly was a man living between two worlds, the professional structure of the NBA and the distractions of a city that never sleeps. He was young, he had money in his pocket for the first time in his life, and he was surrounded by the heavy temptations of the late 70s New York scene. The fans loved his hustle, but behind the locker room doors, a question was starting to circulate among the veterans. They wondered if the kid was more interested in being a star in the clubs or a star on the court, a tension that would only tighten as he entered his second year under the bright lights. By the time his second and third seasons rolled around, it looked like Sly Williams was finally figuring it out. He wasn't just the garbage man anymore. He was becoming a legitimate offensive threat that opposing coaches had to account for in their scouting reports. He had this way of gliding to the rim that made the game look easy, and his scoring numbers started to reflect a player who was on the verge of becoming a cornerstone for the franchise. According to official NBA records, his production took a massive leap during the 1980 to 1981 season, where he jumped up to 13.2 points per game, followed by another increase to 13.8 the following year. On the stat sheet, he was a success story, a lottery pick who was living up to his draft position. But as his scoring average climbed, his professional habits were reportedly moving in the opposite direction. While he was appearing in games, logging exactly 252 appearances over his 4 years in New York, the quality of his preparation was becoming a major point of contention. Sports media reports from those years began to mention ongoing disciplinary issues and a recurring problem with punctuality. It wasn't just that he was late for a bus here or there, it was a perceived lack of respect for the team's time and the game itself. In interviews later on, teammates would recall a player who seemed to think his talent gave him a free pass to ignore the rules that everyone else had to follow. Reporters noted at the time that the Knicks management was growing weary of the constant babysitting required to keep Sly focused. You had a player shooting nearly 50% from the floor, yet the front office couldn't trust him to show up for a morning shoot-around. This created a strange atmosphere where his on-court value was high, but his locker room stock was plummeting. The organization was at a crossroads trying to weigh his double-digit scoring against the headache of his off-court antics. Everyone knew something had to give, but no one expected the breaking point to come in the form of an excuse so transparently thin that it became a piece of league folklore. The end of the road in New York didn't come because of a shooting slump or a blown defensive assignment. It came because of a lie that effectively ended his credibility with the organization. It's one of those stories that older fans still talk about when they discuss the wasted potential of that era. Sly had skipped a mandatory team practice, and when the front office finally tracked him down to ask where he had been, he reportedly offered an explanation that left everyone in the building speechless. According to memoirs and television reports, he looked his employers in the eye and claimed there had been a slight tragedy in the family, a phrase so bizarre and vague that it immediately raised every red flag in the building. It was the kind of excuse that told the Knicks everything they needed to know. It wasn't just that he had missed work, it was that he didn't respect them enough to come up with a believable reason. In interviews, people around the situation suggested this was the moment the front office realized they could no longer build a future around a man who viewed his responsibilities as a joke. By the spring of 1983, the tension had reached a boiling point. Despite the fact that he was still a productive player, shooting over 48% during that final stretch, the decision was made to move on. The organization was ready to cut its losses and ship the headache elsewhere. Court records and public documents from his later life would show a man who struggled with accountability, but in 1983 he was still just a basketball player who needed a change of scenery. The Knicks finally found a taker in the South, pulling the trigger on a deal that would send Sly away from the only professional home he had ever known. On June 29, 1983, the news broke that Sly Williams had been traded to the Atlanta Hawks, a move that many hoped would be the wake-up call he desperately needed. By the summer of 1983, the New York Knicks had reached their limit with the missed practices and the erratic explanations. They decided to send their problems south, hoping that a change in atmosphere might finally get through to a man whose talent was too big to ignore, but whose discipline was nowhere to be found. According to official transaction logs, the deal went down on June 29, 1983, when the Knicks shipped Sly Williams to the Atlanta Hawks in exchange for Rudy Macklin. It was a classic change of scenery trade, a chance for Sly to leave the bright lights of Manhattan for the slower, humid rhythm of the A, where the pressure might be lower and the focus could return to the game. However, the change of zip code didn't fix the underlying issues. Instead of a career resurgence, his time in Atlanta was defined by a body that was starting to betray him. During his 2 years with the Hawks from 1983 to 1985, Sly was plagued by a string of problems that kept him off the hardwood, including a broken thumb, a broken foot, and a persistent lower intestinal ailment. According to medical updates and press conference transcripts at the time, he managed to play in only 47 games over those 2 seasons. While the official report cited bad luck and freak injuries, the whispers in the locker room suggested something more concerning. Reporters noted at the time that his recovery periods were stretching longer than expected, leading some to wonder if his conditioning and off-court habits were making it impossible for his body to heal. It was a frustrating period for the Hawks organization, which had traded for a dynamic scorer only to find a player who spent more time in street clothes than in a jersey. That month, the press was writing about the fragility of a man who should have been in the physical prime of his life at 26 years old. There were rumors, never fully verified by the team, that his lifestyle was catching up to him and that the hustle he showed on the court in New York had been replaced by a lack of urgency in his rehabilitation. He was becoming a luxury the Hawks could no longer afford to carry on the payroll. The once bright future of a first-round lottery pick was fading into the background of the league, and by the end of 1985, his time in Atlanta was officially cut short by a waiver wire decision. Just when it seemed like the league had moved on from the Sly Williams experiment, the most legendary executive in basketball history decided to play a hunch. Red Auerbach, the man who built the Boston Celtics dynasty, had a reputation for finding value where others only saw trouble. In the offseason of 1985, the Celtics made the shocking move to sign Sly as a free agent. It was a move that sent ripples through the sports world, the gold standard of NBA franchises taking a chance on a player who had been labeled a locker room liability. According to major sports media reports, the logic was simple. The Celtics were already a powerhouse with Larry Bird and Kevin McHale, and Sly was a low-risk, high-reward insurance policy for a team chasing another championship. But the culture in Boston was a different beast altogether. The Celtics didn't just ask for talent. They demanded a level of preparation and selflessness that Sly had never quite mastered. In player interviews conducted years later, it became clear that there was a massive disconnect between what the team expected and what Sly thought his role would be. Instead of being grateful for the lifeline, he reportedly struggled with the idea of being a bench player. He was used to being the man, the high school phenom who put up 30 points a night, and he couldn't wrap his head around being a role player on a championship squad. Reporters noted at the time that he publicly voiced his frustration, complaining that he hadn't come to Boston just to watch the game from the sidelines. In interviews, he said something close to this, that he thought he'd be playing 25 minutes a night, not 5. It was a staggering display of a lack of self-awareness. To question your minutes on a team led by Bird and McHale while coming off 2 years of constant injury was seen as the height of arrogance by the Boston veterans. Red Auerbach didn't tolerate dissent, especially from a newcomer who hadn't yet proven he could stay healthy. The tension in the locker room began to simmer before the first month of the season was even over. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine if Sly could humble himself for the sake of a ring, or if his pride would cost him his last real shot at professional relevance. The experiment in Boston didn't just fail, it collapsed with breathtaking speed. While the 1985 to 1986 Celtics were busy putting together one of the greatest seasons in the history of the sport, Sly Williams was becoming a ghost in the rotation. According to Basketball Archives, his entire tenure as a Celtic lasted for exactly 6 regular season games. During that brief window, he averaged a meager 2.8 points and 9 minutes of playing time per game. It was a statistical ghost of the player who had once dominated the Big East and fought for boards at the Garden. He looked a step slow, his conditioning was questioned by the staff, and the personal issues that had followed him from New York were reportedly resurfacing behind the scenes. Official public documents showed that the end came on December 2, 1985, when the Boston Celtics officially waived him. The team's statement was brief, citing a variety of personal reasons that they chose not to elaborate on at the time. Television coverage at the time focused on how quickly the garbage man had been discarded by the league's elite, but the real story was what Sly was losing. By being cut in December, he was walking away from a team that would go on to win 67 games and an NBA title. He wasn't just losing a job, he was losing a championship ring and the security that comes with being a part of a winning culture. The release signaled the unofficial end of his NBA journey at the age of 27. He had gone from a first-round lottery pick to a man with no team and a reputation that made him untouchable to general managers across the league. According to major sports media reports, there were no more phone calls, no more tryouts, and no more lifelines from legendary executives. The money that had flowed so freely during his years with the Knicks was no longer coming in, and the transition from the private jets of the NBA to the reality of the working world was a shock his system wasn't prepared for. He was a man with a heavy wallet and even heavier habits, and with the sudden disappearance of his 1985 salary, the financial freefall was about to begin. The transition from the NBA to the real world is a quiet kind of heartbreak that rarely makes the highlight reels. For most of the 1980s, Sly Williams lived in a world of first-class flights and high-end hotels, but by the time the 1990s rolled around, that life was a distant memory. When the basketball checks stop clearing and the entourage disappears, the drop is steep for a man without a college degree or a backup plan. According to sports media retrospectives, by the late 1980s and through the 1990s, his lucrative professional earnings had reportedly vanished, leaving him entirely outside the ecosystem of professional sports. He wasn't just out of the league, he was out of options. Reporters noted at the time that the fame didn't just fade, it evaporated. You go from being the garbage man at the Garden to just another face in the crowd, trying to figure out how to pay the bills. By the early 2000s, the man who once traded buckets with Larry Bird was punching a clock in a much grittier environment. Television reports from that era confirmed that Sly was working as a machine operator at a pipe and plastics company in New York, earning just a tiny fraction of the thousands he used to make in a single night. It's a sobering image, a first-round talent working the line, surrounded by the hum of industrial machinery instead of the roar of a crowd. But as his status dropped, his internal frustrations were quietly building toward a breaking point. One version of the story says he was a man who felt the world owed him something for the glory days, and when the world stopped paying, the anger started to seep out. This wasn't just a story about a lost fortune anymore. It was about a man losing his grip on his own humanity. The quiet struggle of the factory floor was about to be shattered by a headline that would make his slight tragedy excuse from years ago look like a minor misunderstanding. In September of 2001, the story took a violent, irreversible turn that changed everything. The fall of 2001 was a heavy time for the whole country, but in a small corner of New York, Sly Williams was creating a nightmare of his own. The erratic behavior that had once been dismissed as immaturity on the basketball court had morphed into something far more sinister. Court records showed that in September of 2001, Sly was accused of holding a woman captive against her will for approximately 24 hours. This wasn't a locker room dispute or a missed practice. This was a serious felony that carried the weight of a lifetime. According to public documents from that investigation, the victim reported a terrifying ordeal where she was tied up and explicitly threatened with a knife. The details were grim, suggesting a level of violence and control that shocked those who only remembered him as a talented forward for the Knicks. It made people ask, how does a man go from the pinnacle of professional sports to a situation involving a deadly weapon and a 24-hour kidnapping? Some sources argued that he was a man completely unraveled by his personal crises, unable to distinguish between his own desires and the law. Reporters noted at the time that the legal system seemed to move with a strange kind of hesitation in the wake of that first incident. Despite the severity of the allegations, he wasn't immediately locked away for the long term, a decision that remains a point of deep controversy. It was a failure of the system that left a victim vulnerable and a dangerous man on the loose. The community was left wondering if he had finally reached the end of his rope or if there was still more damage to be done. The answer came just 4 months later, in January of 2002, when the situation escalated into a full-scale legal catastrophe. If the first incident in late 2001 was a warning, the events of early 2002 were the final bell. On a cold day in January of 2002, the law finally caught up with Sly Williams for good. According to major sports media reports at the time, he was formally arrested after allegedly attacking the same woman for a second time. It was a staggering development, to be under the microscope for a violent kidnapping and then to return to the same victim just months later. It showed a man who had lost all sense of consequence, a man who believed the rules of the world still didn't apply to him. The legal hammer didn't just fall, it crushed what was left of his reputation. According to press coverage from the spring of 2002, a grand jury issued a sweeping indictment against the former NBA star in March. The charges were heavy, including first-degree kidnapping, burglary, and multiple counts of serious physical assault. These weren't just headlines, they were the kind of counts that carry a life sentence at the end of them. Reporters noted at the time that the former garbage man looked a world away from his playing days as he stood before a judge, the physical tools that once made him a millionaire now just the frame of a man facing decades in a cage. Television coverage at the time focused on the tragedy of the wasted life, but the focus was quickly shifting to the safety of the community. The local news was filled with images of the former Knick in a jumpsuit, a sight that felt like a punch to the gut for the fans who used to cheer his name at the Garden. His legal team began the frantic work of trying to find a way out, but the evidence was stacking up like an insurmountable lead in the fourth quarter. While he waited for his fate to be decided in a county jail cell, Sly decided to do something that most lawyers would advise against. He agreed to an interview that would reveal just how far he had drifted from reality. Sitting in a cold cell in the Broome County Jail is a long way from the bright lights and the luxury of the NBA, but if you listened to Sly Williams talk in the summer of 2002, you might have thought he was just waiting for the next season to start. He had a way of speaking about his life that felt completely detached from the gravity of the crimes he was accused of committing. Instead of showing the kind of remorse you'd expect from a man facing decades behind bars, he seemed to view his entire downward spiral as just another chapter in a long, complicated career. In an interview conducted in mid-2002, he looked back at the chaos surrounding his arrest and said, "It has been a mess, but I always had fun with that." Reporters noted at the time that Sly spoke with a startling amount of charisma, almost as if he were still holding court in a post-game locker room. He didn't seem to grasp that the world had stopped seeing him as a basketball player and started seeing him as a serious threat to the community. He even tried to frame his lack of focus on the court as a byproduct of his need for high-stakes adrenaline. Looking back to the start of his journey in 1976, he told a reporter in an interview, "I thrived on big games. If it wasn't a big game, I was lost." It was a revealing admission. A man who couldn't find the motivation to do the right thing unless the cameras were on and the crowd was roaring. This psychological defense mechanism allowed him to treat his violent actions and his legal trouble as mere adversity rather than a total moral collapse. But while Sly was busy romanticizing his past and treating the jailhouse like a temporary stop, the legal system was moving forward with a very different perspective. The charm offensive wasn't working on the prosecutors, who were looking at the evidence of a 24-hour ordeal involving a knife and a terrified victim. The time for talk was rapidly running out, and by August of that year, the reality of his situation finally forced a decision that would put a definitive end to his life as a free man. The legal saga of Sly Williams didn't end with a dramatic trial or a grand defense. In the end, it was settled with a quiet plea deal that spared his victim the pain of testifying in open court. According to court records, in August of 2002, the former first-round pick admitted his guilt, pleading specifically to kidnapping charges. This move allowed him to avoid the possibility of a much longer sentence if he had been convicted on every count of the sweeping indictment, including the most serious sexual assault allegations. It was a calculated legal maneuver, but it was also a final admission that the garbage man had truly reached the end of the road. The final hammer came down on September 13, 2002, when a judge officially sentenced him to 5 years in state prison. At 44 years old, while his contemporaries were moving into coaching, broadcasting, or enjoying their retirements,